Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. This is the second chapter of my novel. Please read the prologue first. Like you should. So, this chapter we finally get into the main plot line, with chapter 1, obviously. So if you remember last time, the old crone talked about the first hero, which we're now going to hear from, because I just wanted to say that because it's been a week break, unless you're listening to this right now, all in order. Alright, I'm gonna get started now. Without further ado, here is chapter 1, Friends and Sisters. The first. Water dripped slowly around him, down from the ceiling of the cell, plop on the stone ground, plop on the iron bars, plop on Farrell's unkempt, utterly exhausted head. He stood, well, maybe hung was a more apt expression, chained by his wrists and ankles to the far wall. Pain sizzled down his arms every second as the cold metal of the manacles dug into the flesh below his hands. For a while he'd been able to relieve the pain somewhat by standing, barefoot on the cool stone, but his legs had long since given out on him. How long had it been since he'd eaten, drank anything? Farrell couldn't begin to guess. The suffocating blackness of the prison had long since extinguished any sense of time he'd possessed, but what use would that be to him, anyway? Knowing just how long he'd been left to rot down here in the dark would just make his situation seem all the more hopeless. So in his head, he simply settled for a bloody long time. That was the best he could do, anyway. He couldn't think straight. Farrell's mind kept meandering back to what he wouldn't do for a sip of water right now. Water. Taste it, swim in it, plop, drops from the ceiling. If he had the strength to lift his head, he would have opened his mouth and swallowed the sewer water that dripped into his cell. He smacked his lips, feeling that one spot on his tongue that remained dry as a bone. It wouldn't be long now. If the jailer, lost in a bottle of spirits, no doubt, neglected to give him his daily splash of cold, moldy slosh to the face, then he would surely die. Now that he thought about it, maybe that was all right. Didn't he deserve it? Yes, he conceded, his last depressing thought before the world around him began to grow hazy and consciousness began to slip from his grasp. At the beginning of the end had been his sister, barely 18, with deep blue eyes, rosy pink cheeks, and the most beautiful golden hair that fell to her waist in waves. Afy certainly had been an object of desire in the budding town of Elba. The only problem was that the damn girl wouldn't settle. Many a man, rich, powerful, handsome, had asked for her hand, and yet she had turned down every single one. "I don't get it," he said to her one day. "You could have literally any man you want." But she simply shook her head sadly. "I don't want any man, Farrell. If I have to pick a man at all, I only want Kieran." Afy paused as she felt Farrell stiffen beside her. Kieran. The name made his heart sink. He was Farrell's best friend, Afy's paramour, but he was also a soldier, just like Farrell, tasked with protecting Elba and all of the towns scattered across the Great Plains like a handful of grain. Farrell didn't even want to think about what they were protecting them from, strange, disfigured creatures, black as the night in the desert from which they came. Unlike Farrell, however, Kieran had been one of the trusted few to be sent on a mission westward to attempt to find the source of these vile invasions. Farrell wished that he had been one of the few to go instead, if only to spare Kieran, but when he asked the Bandia, the leader of their town, just why she had been, as per usual, damnably cryptic, she merely smiled and told him that he had a different quest to complete. But neither he nor Afy had heard from Kieran, or anyone else in his company for that matter, in months. Everyone around them had grown suspiciously quiet for a while, enough time to realize that none of the men sent into the desert were probably coming back. They gave her a little more time after that to mourn, before the suitors began to flock to Afy like vultures around a corpse. Afy was beautiful, desirable, after all. They gave her fabulous gifts, promises of wealth. Some even took to reading truly awful poetry outside her window at night. But she denied every single proposal. In her eyes, no one could compare to Kieran. Some people, however, weren't too keen on that answer. The most persistent of these was the son of a wealthy merchant, a man by the name of Bradrick, to the point where Farrell had had to put his fist down several times and threaten him with a beating to get him to leave her alone. He was handsome enough, Farrell supposed, made more so by the way the ladies positively swooned whenever he came near, but most importantly, he had money. and lots of it, which made him a highly attractive choice for anyone. A shame about his personality. He was witty and cunning, but there was something undeniably, what was the word? Slimy. That was it. Of course, Afy had turned him down, just like the others, rather politely, as was her way with people, but Bradrick was a man who was used to getting everything he wanted. He was vain beyond measure and had taken her refusal as a sort of challenge. He had done everything. Expensive gifts, invitations to fancy parties. He even hired a few musicians to accompany him while he attempted to serenade her. Farrell had never been more sure that if he had to hear another minute of that, then his ears would start to bleed. If there was one thing in this world that Bradrick simply couldn't buy, it was a decent singing voice. But after a while, and after many repeated refusals, Bradrick finally seemed to get the idea. Soon, everyone else did too. It finally became apparent to everyone that unless Kieran were to somehow return from the dead, Afy would remain a spinster. And as things began to calm down, Farrell began to feel safe about leaving her alone at home when he was assigned to patrol. Ever since their parents had died, killed in one of the very first creature attacks, they had lived alone in a small cottage near the edge of town. "Good night, brother," she would say after dinner had been cleared away, and then, giving him a hug for luck, "Have fun," to which he would snort. Fun was not the word he would have used to describe guard duty, but someone had to do it. Afy was nervous for him, always was, but she wouldn't say it. Farrell worried too. He often wondered what would happen to her if he were to go out for patrol one night and not come home. He sighed. You'll have to get married sometime." "Why should I?" Afy's hand went to the locket at her chest, which he knew contained a picture of her and a man with friendly green eyes, bronze skin, and a big smile. Kieran had always been smiling. "Because, silly," he said, mussing her hair, "I can't keep supporting you forever. What happens if I meet a girl?" Afy tittered, one eyebrow cocked. "You? And a girl? Never. You'd marry your work long before you'd ever think of a woman." "And what's wrong with that?" He smiled, shrugging. "I keep you safe, don't I?" Except that night, something had happened. Something that not even Farrell had expected. It hadn't been a creature. They seemed to have become especially quiet in the last few months, but by something else entirely. As the dawn had barely begun to shine over the thick trees of the nearby forest, Farrell walked home, his steel-toed boots clinking softly against the packed dirt ground, whistling to himself. Once the day broke, his worries mostly ended. The creatures usually attacked at night, and none of them seemed too keen about the sun, so Farrell was gradually getting calmer, if a bit tired. Right now, his mind was solely focused on a nice hot breakfast and then a warm bed. But those thoughts were abruptly shaken from his mind as his house came into view. Something was wrong. He could tell that right away. Afy always, without fail, left a candle burning in the small front window for him after she went to bed. Now the house was completely dark. His heart pounded in his chest as he began to pick up his pace, trying to get to the house as quickly as was humanely possible. Everything was fine, he tried in vain to convince himself. Afy was probably tired and simply forgot to light the candle, which she had never done once in the 5 years that he'd been a soldier. He had to get home. As he came closer to the old worn door, Farrell had to force himself to grab the door handle, and with a bit of effort, it tended to stick, turn it. His heart sank rapidly. It was unlocked. Clenching his teeth, eyes closed, Farrell opened the door. The front room was dark. Too dark. And so quiet. Farrell stood in the doorway for a moment, frozen in fear. His feet were stuck in place like they had been glued there against his will. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything. Terror coursed through him, hopping in his chest like some obscene abomination of a rabbit, one with about 10 pairs of feet. Where was Afy? Why was she not here? What in the world could have happened to her? Then, floating gently out of Afy's room, came a soft sob. Maybe it wasn't so much sobbing as a gentle sniffing, the sound of someone who has no more tears to shed. Farrell's heart leapt momentarily. She was here! She was all right! But then it held mid-beat as he asked himself exactly why she was crying. Afy never cried. Not even when Kieran left. Not even after he hadn't come back. What could be so horrible to make her cry? Farrell approached her bedroom door and, after hesitating for a brief moment, knocked quietly. The sobbing ceased, but no one answered. "Afy?" he asked the door. The bed springs creaked as someone ran across the ground to the door, and before he could blink, she was through the door and in his arms. "Farrell!" she sobbed, letting her tears run wild, which stained his shirt. His eyebrows knitted together as Afy clutched him, almost desperately, and he pulled away. For a moment he wasn't even sure that the woman standing before him was really his sister. Her eyes were hollow and had lost their shine. Her cheeks were pale as death, with no hint of their usual rosiness. But most of all, she looked so small, her shawl clutched tightly around her. No, it was her, but what could have possibly happened to induce such a change in her after only one night? He sat her down at the table, then perched at the edge of a chair himself, right next to her as she gripped his hand tightly, so tightly, unwilling or unable to let go. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Taking a deep breath, Aphie tried to speak, but stopped as a fresh flow of tears poured from her empty eyes. "It's okay," he said, hugging her tightly. "I'm here. It's going to be all right." She cried for a minute more, then pulled away, attempting to compose herself, and she tried so hard to speak, but in the end, Aphie could only pluck a single word from her lips. "Bradrick." Standing up, not even thinking, Farrell instinctively reached for the sword on his belt as if he were ready to be attacked. Anger swelled up through his veins, and he couldn't think. That one word was all he needed to hear to understand what had happened, the unthinkable thing that he had done. "Last night?" he asked. She nodded. He hugged her tightly, so tightly, and she equally so. Farrell didn't think, but somehow he knew what he was going to do. "Stay here," he said calmly. "Lock the door. I'll be back soon." He ran to the door, that one single-minded purpose flowing through him like water, boiling hot, fiery water that burned him from the inside with pure rage. Turning back to her once more, Aphie looked as if she wanted to stop him, but there was no hope in that. "Don't worry." He patted his sword. "I'll make sure that he never hurts you again." Farrell closed the door behind him. That bastard, that absolute son of a bitch! How could he have possibly done something so terrible, so inhuman? Farrell had been fighting demons for years, but he saw clearly now that Bradrick was the biggest of them all. And he would pay dearly. He would pay in blood. Farrell didn't remember much after that. All he knew was that he had found himself in Bradrick's house, a nice columned affair in the heart of the village, and, quite of its own accord, saw his hand reach for the doorknob and turn it. It was locked, but he kicked it in anyway. The bastard himself, who it seemed had fallen asleep halfway through a bottle of spirits at the kitchen table, awoke with a start as he heard the violent explosion of wood and metal hinges. Seeing Farrell's fiery smolder, Bradrick immediately began to stumble backwards, away, as far away as he could get. There were a few words exchanged that were of little importance. Farrell informed him of his grave error, and the bastard denied ever having done such a thing. But he stuttered. Who was Farrell to believe, This drunken pretty boy, or his own sister? It was no contest, really. Farrell's fist stung from the impact as Bradrick's jaw cracked and he was tossed to the ground by the force of the punch, but that wouldn't be nearly enough to satisfy the anger. Oh no, not even close. The one thing that Farrell was sure he would never forget was the look in Bradrick's swelled, blackened eyes as he raised his sword, that scared yet oddly accepting look as he finally realized the full extent of his wrongdoing. And then there was blood. Blood on his sword, blood on his hands, blood staining the blue of his tunic. But the question was, did he care? Not until memory began devolving into nightmares, Bradrick kept bleeding, that he began to care. The red was up to Farrell's knees, now his waist, and soon he was gargling with blood, drowning in it. It crawled down his throat, filling his lungs, choking him, and then... "Oi! Wake up!" Slowly, Farrell opened his eyes. The chains attached to his arms rattled ominously, expending their momentum from his previous bout of thrashing. He was back in his cell, still chained to the wall. There was no blood, excepting, of course, the thin trickle that ran down his arms from where the metal of the manacles had bit into him. Blinking, Farrell tried desperately to wake up. The jailer, his ugly, dirt-stained face and sour breath far too close for comfort, stood in front of him with a pail of water clutched in his filthy hands. This, Farrell realized, probably explained why his face was wet. Wait. Water. Water. Pail of water. Farrell's dehydrated brain slowly managed to put it all together. What the jailer had in his hands was the most appealing beverage known to mankind, not the sweetest honey nor the strongest spirits, but water. He managed to croak, then cough pathetically. The jailer, agonizingly, looked down at the small metal bucket. "All right," he said, "but only 'cause you have a visitor." The words passed directly 10 feet over Farrell's head. All he could think about was the pail coming closer and closer to the hole that was so dry it almost couldn't be called a mouth anymore. The jailer slowly tipped a few sips, and most of it dribbled down his chin, but Farrell managed to get several gulps of the stuff down his throat before it was taken away. It was warm, and tasted like iron, but it was one of the best things he had ever tasted. Slowly, his mind began to clear. Not much, but just enough so that he was able to register exactly what it was the jailer had said. A visitor? Now? His sister, it must be, but why hadn't she come before? His sense of time must have been worse off than he'd thought. He must not have been here all that long. The door just beyond his cell swung open then, and Farrell looked up in anticipation. But the woman who came through the door wasn't his sister. Danae. He whispered her name, unable to help himself as the Bandia, an angel, the leader of their small village, and maybe soon all of the villages scattered across the Great Plains, strode into the dark prison. After who really knew how long he'd been trapped in that dank, miserable place, she looked like a light from above. Her dark hair fell into ringlets over her cloak, and her almond-shaped eyes with their luminous blue pupils seemed to glow even in the dim half-light. Farrell felt a taut smile slowly spreading across his hollow cheeks. Maybe it was the dehydration talking, but if he was honest, Farrell had never really gotten over her. In another life, maybe they would have found happiness together, but they had both traveled down very different paths. She was the almost divine ruler of a city, soon to be kingdom, and he was a lowly nobody. Now a murderer. But he still couldn't take his eyes off of her, even half dead as he was. He would, of course, take those feelings to the grave with him. When Danae stared back at him, however, she did not smile. Farrell. He saw her name pass her lips, barely audible. She bit her lip, seemingly fighting against the rage that burned in her usually clear eyes. What are you doing to him? She asked the jailer, fist clenched. Can't you see he's in pain? But, my man, said the jailer, taken aback, he's a murderer. He killed somebody. Somebody very important. Danae stuck at her chin, staring the jailer down with what Farrell always referred to as her noble leader glare. I am aware of his transgressions, she told him, but this is wrong. No human being should be treated in this fashion. I demand you unshackle him at once. In any other circumstance, Farrell probably would have told her that he was actually okay. The pain kind of disappeared once your arms went numb, but who was he to complain? Grumbling, the jailer entered his cell, and, not without being particularly harsh on his already raw wrists, unshackled him from the moist stone wall. Farrell attempted to stand for a moment, but his legs seemed to have been replaced with jelly, and gave out under him after a valiant effort. Collapsing to the ground, he plopped face first into a small pile of hay, and he was so hungry that he probably would have started eating it like a cow right then and there if he hadn't been in polite company. Now leave us, Danae instructed, to which she merely got a raised eyebrow. No need to go so quickly. There's nothing to fear. I have protection. She gestured back to her bodyguard, a man who could only be described as hulking, despite the fact that his bare, bronze chest glowed even through the gloom, who smiled and waved. It's not like he'd have the strength to attack me anyway after you've starved him so, she added under her breath as the jailer took his leave. Danae waited for a moment, then, eyes permanently fixed on him, floated slowly over to Farrell's cell. She wrapped her delicate hands around the cold iron bars and gazed down at him with a damnably pitying expression. I'm so sorry, Farrell, she whispered, eyes wet. If I'd known what they'd do to you, I would have never... Bullshit, he managed to choke out. His throat felt like someone had taken to it with an especially coarse piece of sandpaper. She froze, an undeniable guilty expression etched into her face. You know this is exactly what they do to murderers. You just tried to ignore it. Your flock would have dethroned you otherwise. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, though it did make him angry. Deep down he understood the concept of the greater good all too well. He was a soldier, after all. Looking away from him, Danae sighed. Yes, she choked out. You're right. You always are. And I'm sorry. I'd say no hard feelings, but I don't think it'd sound very sincere, he croaked. She tittered despite herself, and it reverberated around the cell like a dance. Farrell had always loved to hear her laugh. Don't worry, she said. I'm going to get you out of here. And just how do you plan on doing that? He asked. They both knew that once you were in prison, you never got out. Not even if you had the Bandias say so. It just didn't happen. I had another vision. Unless, of course, you were a doomsday prophet whose visions had saved the whole of the Great Plains more than once. Then maybe getting someone out of prison was as easy as pie. Danae had always had visions, strange dreams that plagued her while she slept, ever since they were children. Little did they know that they would land her a kingdom, because once she figured out what they meant, Danae's visions were always right. A vision? He asked, attempting to sit up. He got about halfway there before falling back on his stomach again. Compromising, he managed to hoist himself up on an elbow. Closing her eyes, Danae concentrated, bringing the vision back. When she spoke next, her words ran together in a sort of monotonous mumbling, and her face took on a blank expression as if she was sleeping. I was sitting in a pavilion, floating amidst the clouds, she began, and I couldn't leave it, but I could see everything. The forest, the mountains, all of the towns, all of the people. And here she frowned, as if seeing something unpleasant. But then I saw a storm. The biggest storm I'd ever seen, rising in the west, the desert, and slowly it covered everything, a great evil unlike anything we'd ever seen. The people were screaming, dying, but I was so scared I couldn't do anything. Though her eyes were still closed, Danae looked up suddenly, and smiled, radiant, as if a warm sunbeam had miraculously appeared above her. And then I saw them. "Who?" Farrell asked, after she had paused for too long for his liking. She swayed back and forth slowly, almost as if she was dancing to some kind of melody. "The heroes." The word hung in the air a moment, holding some mysterious weight of their own, before she continued. "I couldn't see their faces, but they fought against the storm, chased it back to the desert, and their leader... Why, their leader was you." She opened her eyes then, 2 twinkling stars, and stared through him, smiling. "Me?" Farrell asked, disbelieving. "If you couldn't see their faces, how could you tell? That man could have been anyone." Her eyes widened. "I just knew. I don't know how, but I could feel it. The way he stood. His scarf. He was wearing a scarf. Oh, well, that settles it." "You always didn't like your scarves," Danae smiled. "But you do know what this means?" she asked, coming as close to him as the bars would allow. "You have a destiny. The evil will come from the desert. You have to go there and stop it before it's too late." If anyone else had told him that he had to suddenly up and become some kind of hero, then he would have laughed. Hard. But this was Danae. If she thought that he had a destiny, then odds were that she was probably right. "And what about these other heroes you saw?" he asked. She shook her head. "You will never meet them, nor will I. They will come after you. Your..." She paused, searching for the word. "Soul will inspire them." That's a little cryptic. "I'm sorry. That's all I know." "So I'm supposed to go to the desert." He thought about it briefly. "Can I rest first, or do you want me to crawl there right now?" Danae laughed. "Of course not. We have a little bit of time left." "Can I see Aphie?" The smile dropped abruptly off of Danae's face faster than Farrell could blink, and his heart went with it. Something was wrong. What was it? What could have possibly happened now? "Farrell," she said quietly, "Aphie's dead." "What?" the boy shouted, standing from his seat at the crone's table. "She died?" "Yes," the crone nodded, cupping a mug of hot tea in her wrinkled hands, which had periodically made the trek up to her wrinkled mouth as she spoke. "She killed herself, after everything that had happened to her, and with her brother in jail, something just snapped. Didn't even leave a note." The boy's nose crinkled in confusion. He sat back down. I don't think I understand. What exactly did Bradrick do to her that was so terrible?" Coughing, the crone looked downwards and blew out a huge breath, slowly. "Perhaps it's best if we continue that story another time. Let's maybe talk about a different hero." "Another time?" the boy asked. "Are you saying I can come back to hear more stories?" He leaned forward, excited at the prospect of learning more. The crone shrugged nonchalantly, though there was some sort of odd look in her eye that the boy may or may not have seen. "I don't see why not," she said. "It's nice to have company every once in a while. But anyway," she leaned forward, immediately slipping into the storyteller stance once again. "The next hero was born about 200 years after the first. Now in that time, much had changed. The town of Elba had been united with the many other villages across the Great Plains into a kingdom named Theone, and all prospered." Wait, said the boy. "So this new hero, he was named Farrell too?" "Yes, of course," said the crone, becoming impatient. "They all had the same name, remember? Doesn't that get confusing?" The crone leaned back in thought for a moment, took a sip of her tea. "Yes, I suppose, but I've come up for little nicknames for them, you see. So the first hero is the first, easy enough to remember." Her mug fell back to the table with a soft clunk. The boy felt like maybe he was beginning to understand. "And this new hero is the favored." "Why that name?" The boy leaned forward, quickly becoming engrossed once again. "Well," said the crone, "I don't suppose he was particularly favored in his lifetime, but he is the one who for the longest time was remembered as the hero." "Why?" asked the boy, eyes widening. "Did he do something really heroic? Slay a dragon, or—" "No." The crone shook her head. "He just happened to be born in the right place at the right time. His parents had been traveling through the Elder Woods to Theone with him in tow, trying to escape the civil war in the neighboring kingdom, but they got lost, and, well, bad things happen to people who get lost in the Elder Woods, so the baby was left all alone. Luckily, many spirits lived in those woods, and sensing he was special, raised him as one of their own, away from the strife of the outside world, until one particular day." The Favored. Somewhere far away, in a strange place where the ground was yellow and shifted with the wind, impeded only by the crumbling columns around it, there was a hole in the ground. Not a cave or a lake. The hole was just a hole, filled only with an oozy, black substance that was neither gas nor liquid, yet somehow both all at once. It bubbled and shifted, but slowly, silently, never quite leaving its prison, and anyone who got near enough was immediately filled with a shockingly strong sense of unease at its unnaturalness. But it had never done anything, just sat there in silence, simmering hatefully to itself. Most people left it alone and tried to forget about its existence. Except for today. Today, something happened. Because as the scorching sun rose over the dry, dead earth, something emerged from the depths of the pit. Breaking the surface, a vaguely humanoid creature flailed its arms, attempting in vain to reach solid ground. The thing eventually made contact with the side, but not without a good fight, nearly sinking back into the hole several times, and inadvertently shoveling a few handfuls of sand back into the blackness behind it before it got a hold on the shifting earth. Half crawling, half writhing, covered, surrounded in by the black, it flopped over onto the sand and breathed, just breathed for a moment, its teeth shockingly white against its blackened features. After a moment, it began to stand, haphazardly, trying to get used to footing on solid ground once more. The thing swiped a hand over its face, and most of the black dissipated into the air around it. It, or he, was human, most certainly. He seemed completely normal, save for a few specks of the black that still stuck to his face like stars dotting the sky. And then he opened his eyes. They were certainly not normal. They glowed an otherworldly bright yellow, so light that you almost had to squint to look at them. But the most shocking thing of all was not the color. Something was off about them, something unnatural. Something seemed to be moving, squirming, writhing behind those eyes as if trying to break free. The innate feeling of dread that instantly filled him was enough to wake Farrell up. He practically jumped out of his small bed for fear of those horrible eyes. Then, after a moment, he glanced around and breathed a sigh of relief. He was at home, in his bed, the sounds of the forest canopy gently caressing his ears, the leaves on the trees casting peaceful shadows on his wall. Farrell ran a hand through his thick, blonde hair and blew out a lungful of air. Boy, what a dream. No, wait, it hadn't really been the dream itself, had it? What scared him most was just how real it seemed, like that terrifying man from the hole in the ground could really actually exist somewhere, like those eyes existed. He shivered, despite the humidity, not really wanting to think about it anymore. A place like that couldn't be real, could it? Either way, there was nothing he could do about it now. It was just a dream, a recurring nightmare that had plagued him for the last few months. Farrell shook himself, trying to rid himself of that lingering sense of dread that seemed to cling to him like woolly bits of fuzz. Plopping out of bed, he padded around the trunk of the tree that ran through the center of his round house and over to the door. He threw it open, the old hinges squeaking against the strain, and hoped that the morning air would clear his head. Staring up at the forest canopy right above his head, Farrell breathed deeply, and soon he did begin to feel better. Sometimes, maybe just a little, he wished that he had parents, or even just some kind of adult that he could tell his worries, like this dream he was having, too. But he was okay, really. All of his friends in the village were fine, and they didn't have parents. In fact, everyone in the village was a child, and it had been that way for a long time, as long as he could remember. For a split second he paused. Just why were there no adults? But they got along just fine on their own without any grown-ups anyway. Their lives were peaceful in the woods, eating nuts and berries, playing all day, splashing through mud puddles after it rained. Life was perfect. Perfectly boring, Farrell thought to himself, but he couldn't tell any of the others that. Shutting his door quietly behind him, Farrell began to climb carefully down the ladder just outside of his home in the trees. Maybe he'd go see Mela. She was his best friend in the world, and while she may not have understood his borderline obsession with seeing and experiencing things outside of their secluded village, she always listened anyway, which was more than some of the others ever did. Yeah, that was what he would do. He reached the bottom of the ladder and plopped onto the rickety bridge that stretched between the trunks of the large forest trees. Farrell glanced at the ground far below him as he expertly navigated the maze of bridges and walkways that reached out like a spider's web between the sturdy oaks of the woods. Briefly, he wondered how it had all been built and just who had built it, but he shook himself and tried not to think about it. Most people didn't think about things like that, so why was he so odd? After a few minutes of quiet contemplation, he reached the door, a small affair painted in cheerful colors, to Mela's home, and knocked quietly. "Mela?" he asked. "Are you up yet?" A minute later, the door opened, but it was not the round, good-natured face of his best friend on the other side. Instead, he was greeted by the somewhat tired, rosy features of Bali, the nurse. "You haven't heard?" she asked, eyebrows crinkling together in a way that worried Farrell. They only did that when she encountered a particularly vexing injury or illness. "I just woke up," he said, craning his neck to try and see past her through the doorway. "Heard what?" Bali sighed. "Mela's sick." Farrell's face fell. "Oh," he said quietly. "She'll be okay, though, right?" He didn't like the look that crossed her face. "You'd better come in and see." Following her into the small, round room, Farrell paused as his eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness. It was strange. Usually Mela's house was bright and sunny, but now the windows had drapes over them like there was something that she didn't want other people to see. Bali led him over to the corner, where she sat in a wicker chair. Farrell's eyes slid past her and onto the small, spindly bed, and that's where Mela lay. Besides an unusual amount of paleness, she didn't seem all that sick. She was sleeping, peacefully, her long black hair resting gracefully over her quilt, which rose and fell gently with her soft breaths. She still wore her scarf from yesterday, as if she had never changed to go to bed. "She's just sleeping," Farrell said. "So what's the—" Her eyelids opened abruptly, pupils merely tiny dots. Mela gasped. She began to convulse and let out something halfway in between a groan and a scream, her eyes rolling up into her head. Bully rose, trying to hold her down, because otherwise she would have shook herself onto the floor. Crying, thrashing as Farrell began to back away, Mela started to scream, "No! No! Get away!" "What's attacking you?" Bully asked, frustrated as she shouted against Mela's wailing. Mela froze for a moment at the question, and sat up, Bully jumping back. Her head turned to one side of the room, as if something was there. The darkness," she mumbled, and then her voice gradually rising to a scream. "It's here! It's come!" "The darkness?" Bully began to quiver. "What's here?" Turning her head once more, this time so hard that Farrell almost feared her neck would snap, Mela turned straight to Farrell, who had been frozen in horror this whole time, except that she couldn't possibly be looking at him because her pupils were now so far into the back of her head that all Farrell could see were the whites of her eyes, but he could still feel her staring at him, through him. "It came from the pit. The black, oozing pit," she croaked, and Farrell froze again. How could she possibly know about that? He hadn't told anyone, not even her, about his dreams. Mela began to laugh, hysterically. "Who is it? What was in the pit?" Farrell shouted over her, and she paused, still staring at him, as all became deathly silent. Not even the leaves in the trees shook. "The beast." Then it all stopped. The writhing, the screaming, and Mela flopped back down on the bed, just as silent and serene as she'd been before. Bully and Farrell both looked at each other and let out the breath that they both realized they had been holding. "What was that?" he asked finally, amid the silence that fell over the small house. Bully scoffed. "You think I know? I've never seen anything like this, ever." It was true, now that he thought about it. His friends in the forest had gotten sick before and had babbled, clouded by fever, but never anything like that. Never had they writhed on the bed, or had their eyes roll back into their heads, or talked nonsense about a beast. That was strange. Collapsing into the chair once more, Bully glanced up at Farrell with worry etched across her face. "I can't imagine what's caused it." Her eyes widened then, as she remembered something. "Wait, you were with her yesterday. Do you know if you saw anything at all that might have driven her crazy in the middle of the night?" He finished for her. He had been with her yesterday. It was true. They had gone on a short walk through the woods that had ended up turning into a rather long walk, gathering fruits for supper that had just begun to ripen on the trees. "I don't think so. Unless—" "What?" She latched onto his hand, desperate for an answer, any answer. What was it? Farrell jumped, still twitchy from the past few minutes' trauma. Well, he began, shrinking under her gaze, we did find these weeds, and they were kind of strange. How? Bully demanded. They were black. Farrell shuffled his feet, feeling like he had done something wrong. Black? Yeah, and Mela touched one. I told her not to, he added as Bully looked about ready to slap him. I told her, but she touched one and then nothing happened, so I heard Mela was sick, shouted a new voice. Bully and Farrell turned to the door, and staring back at them was a scrawny, wide-eyed boy who constantly looked like he was going to punch someone. He saw Farrell then, and his nose crinkled in such a way that suggested that to him Farrell smelled like rotting meat. What are you doing here? He asked, clearly disgusted at the very thought of Farrell's presence. Farrell clenched his fists. She's my friend too, Cal. I've known her for a lot longer than you have, he growled. That doesn't mean anything. Well, both of you shut up, Bully interjected, placing herself squarely between the two warring parties. Your friend, for both of you, she added as Cal opened his abnormally large mouth, is sick. Now, I, for one, have never seen anything like it before, so unless either of you two have, Farrell stared down at his boots as Bully glared at the pair of them, then I suggest that you both listen to me. Whatever you say, Cal said with difficulty after a moment, sucking up his pride. Farrell's eyes widened. So you have some kind of plan, then? It's not much, she admitted, but I think our best bet is to go see Ursa. Silence filled the room for a moment. It was true. Ursa probably would know just what afflicted Mela. She was the closest thing to a mother any of them had, and she had lived for such a long time and knew so many things. But the way to her home at the heart of the forest was long and dangerous, especially for children. But for Mela, Farrell would have done anything. He also would have done anything to best Cal at something, which might have driven him to his quick decision, before Cal could beat him to the punch. All right, he nodded solemnly. When do we leave?